the shadow of the hearth, echoes of the first sleep.
Imagine total darkness. Not the darkness of a bedroom with a glowing clock, nor the dim outlines of a street lamp filtering through the curtains. Imagine a blackness so heavy, so absolute, that it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. In the modern world, we sleep to recharge. But 1,000 years ago, sleep was not a rest, it was a battle for survival. Tonight, you are not in your comfortable bed. You are lying on a pile of crushed straw, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and unwashed wool. You are not alone. You are huddled in a pile of limbs, children, parents, grandparents, and perhaps even a shivering goat seeking the only thing that matters, heat. Welcome to the night of the year 1025. Close your eyes. Can you hear the wolves howling beyond the thin wooden door? This is how they slept. This is how they survived. Chapter 1. The Death of the Sun. The year is 1025 A.D. The location is a small hamlet on the edge of the Weald, England. For Aldred, a man of 30 winters, and old age for many, the day did not end with a clock striking a specific hour. It ended when the sun surrendered to the horizon. In the 11th century, light was the most expensive commodity on earth. Candles made of beeswax were for the church and the lords. For a peasant like Aldred, there was only the rushlight, a strip of dried plant pith soaked in animal fat that burned with a sputtering, smoky flame. "Close the shutters, boy," Aldred grunted, his voice raspy from the day's labor in the frost-bitten fields. His son, Osric, barely 7, pushed the heavy wooden flap over the window. There was no glass. Glass was a myth to them. Once the shutter was closed, the world outside, the world of spirits, bandits, and wolves, was sealed off. Inside the wattle and daub hut, the atmosphere transformed. It was a single room, dominated by the central hearth. There was no chimney. The smoke drifted lazily up to the thatched roof, coating everything in a layer of soot. To a modern nose, the smell would be overpowering, a mix of ancient sweat, curing meat, damp earth, and the manure of the livestock. Yes, livestock. "Bring the cow in closer," Alara commanded gently. She was kneeling by the fire, stirring a pot of thin pottage. This was the first rule of medieval sleep. Warmth is communal. In the corner of the hut, separated only by a low hurdle, stood their prized possession, a dairy cow and 2 goats. The animals were not just food sources, they were living radiators. In the bitter cold of January, the heat radiating from the animals' bodies kept the temperature inside just above freezing. The family ate in semi-darkness, the firelight dancing on their tired faces. There was no leisure time, no reading, no entertainment. The night was dangerous. The night air was believed to carry disease and vapors from the devil. "To the straw," Eldred signaled. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Intimacy. They did not have a bed in the way we understand it. In the center of the room, near the dying embers of the fire, lay a large sackcloth stuffed with fresh straw and dried heather. This was the pallet. They did not change into pajamas. To remove one's woolen tunic was to invite the cold death. They slept in their linen undertunics and often their day clothes. Ealdred lay down first, establishing the boundary. Ilara lay next to him, then the children, packed tight like sardines. They pulled a heavy, coarse woolen blanket over them, topped with a cured bearskin that had been passed down from Ealdred's grandfather. This proximity was not just for warmth, it was for security. In 1025, privacy was a concept that did not exist. People were born, gave birth, wept, and died in the same room, often on the same straw mattress. As they settled, the silence of the pre-industrial world took over. But it wasn't silent. The straw rustled.
The cow chewed its cud loudly. The wind rattled the thatch, and under their skin the itch of fleas was a constant nagging companion, a misery so common it wasn't even complained about. Ealdred wrapped his arm around Ilara. In this huddled mass, amidst the hardship and the fleas, there was a profound, tangible love. They were literally keeping each other alive. The beat of her heart against his back was the only clock he needed. Chapter 3. The Watch, the Second Sleep. Hours passed. The fire died down to a dull red glow. Suddenly, around 2 a.m., Ealdred's eyes snapped open. He wasn't the only one. Ilara shifted, sitting up. This was the most fascinating phenomenon of the medieval world, biphasic sleep. People in 1000 A.D. did not sleep in one distinct 8-hour block. They slept in 2 segments. The first sleep, dead sleep, deep, exhausting oblivion from shortly after sunset until midnight or so. The watch, the waking period, a period of 1 or 2 hours in the middle of the night. And the second sleep, the morning sleep, sleeping until dawn. The hut was pitch black, save for the embers. Ealdred rose, careful not to step on a sleeping child, and added a small log to the fire. "Did you hear the dogs?" whispered Ilara. Her voice was clear, awake. "Just the wind," Ealdred reassured her, though he kept his hand near the iron knife buried in the straw. This waking period was a magical time. The world was frozen. It was the only time a peasant had to think. Without the exhaustion of labor, their minds were clear. For some, this was a time for prayer. Ealdred murmured a clumsy Latin prayer he had learned from the village priest, asking for the harvest to survive the frost. For others, it was a time for intimacy. With the children fast asleep in the first sleep, this quiet hour was when couples reconnected, whispered secrets, and planned for the future. It was a pocket of peace in a life of brutal hardness. "We need to fix the roof before the snow melt," Ilara whispered, passing him a cup of water. "I know," Ealdred sighed, staring at the embers. They sat there for an hour in the semi-darkness, existing between the worlds of dreams and reality. This psychological break allowed them to process the trauma of their harsh lives. It was their therapy. Then, as the fatigue returned, they lay back down. "Sleep now," Ealdred murmured. "The sun brings the plow." They drifted into the second sleep, a lighter, dream-filled rest that would last until the rooster, not an alarm clock, screamed the arrival of dawn.
Chapter 4. The Harsh Morning. Waking up in 1025 was painful. The fire was usually dead. The air inside the hut was freezing, often so cold that a layer of ice would form on the water bucket inside the house. There was no snooze button. To stay in bed was to starve. Ealdred rose before the sun, his joints stiff from the hard floor and the damp cold. He looked down at his family, a tangle of limbs, messy hair, and peaceful faces buried in furs. For a moment, despite the poverty, despite the dirt and the smoke, he felt a surge of pride. They had survived another night. The wolves hadn't entered. The fire hadn't burned the house down. The cold hadn't taken the baby. He opened the heavy wooden door. The gray light of medieval England spilled in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. The night was over. The struggle began anew. Chapter 5. The Stone-Cold Luxury. Location: the Manor of Lord Godric, 10 miles south of Ealdred's hut. If Ealdred the peasant battled the cold, Lord Godric battled the silence. To the modern mind, a castle or manor house represents security, but in 1025 AD, a stone keep was essentially a beautifully decorated refrigerator. Stone holds the cold far longer than wood. While Ealdred's small hut trapped the body heat of his family and livestock, Lord Godric's bedchamber was vast, high-ceilinged, and draughty. Godric stood by his window,
a narrow slit in the stone wall designed for firing arrows, not for viewing scenery. A heavy tapestry, woven with scenes of a stag hunt, hung over it to block the draft, but the icy wind of the British winter found its way through, stirring the expensive beeswax candles. "The bed needs tightening," Godric muttered. Here lies a fascinating piece of history, the origin of sleep tight. Godric's bed was a massive piece of oak furniture, a status symbol worth more than an entire peasant village. But there were no box springs. The mattress, a sack of high-quality goose feathers, not straw, rested on a lattice of ropes woven across the bed frame. Over time, these ropes would sag, creating a hammock effect that was bad for the back. His servant, a young boy named Wolf, used a wooden tool to crank and pull the ropes taut. Only when the ropes were tight could the Lord sleep well. Chapter 6. The Ritual of Safety. Rich people did not sleep alone. Privacy was a concept for the future. In Godric's chamber, 3 people would sleep tonight: Godric and his lady in the great bed, and Wolf, the servant, on a trundle, a low rolling bed, or simply on a mat at the foot of the master's bed. Why? Assassination and spirits. Sleep was the time when a lord was most vulnerable. A throat could be slit in silence. Wolf was not just a servant, he was a human alarm system. Before Godric climbed in, Wolf performed the nightly ritual. He took a long iron rod and swept it violently under the bed frame. This wasn't to clean dust, it was to ensure no assassin was hiding beneath the skirts of the bed. Then came the warming pan. Wolf took a long-handled brass pan filled with hot coals from the fireplace and slid it between the linen sheets. He moved it constantly so as not to scorch the fabric. Godric climbed in. The linen was smooth, unlike the peasant's scratchy wool. But as he laid his head on the bolster, he didn't lie flat. Historical note: in the medieval mind, lying completely flat was associated with death. It was the posture of a corpse in a coffin. Therefore, Godric slept half sitting up, propped by 3 or 4 thick pillows. This was also believed to help digestion and prevent the vapors of the stomach from rising to the brain. Chapter 7. The Demon on the Chest. The room was dark, save for a single night candle protected by a horn lantern. Total darkness was feared by the wealthy as much as the poor. At around 1 a.m., deep in the first sleep, Godric awoke with a gasp. He couldn't move. A heavy weight pressed down on his chest. He tried to shout for Wolf, but no sound came out. His vision blurred, and in the corner of the room, amidst the shadows of the tapestries, he saw a shape, a dark, crouching figure with glowing eyes. Today, we call this sleep paralysis. Science explains it as a disconnect between the brain waking up and the muscles remaining in REM atonia. But in 1025 AD, this was the mare. The word nightmare comes from this very experience. The mare was a demon, an incubus or succubus that sat on the sleeper's chest to crush the life out of them or torment their soul. Godric's heart hammered against his ribs. He recited the Pater Noster in his mind, the only weapon he had. Our Father, who art in heaven. Slowly, the paralysis broke. He sat up, gasping, sweat soaking his fine linen nightshirt. "My lord?" Wolf's sleepy voice came from the floor. "The mare," Godric whispered, trembling. "It was here." He reached for the goblet of watered-down wine on his bedside table. He would not sleep easily again tonight. The fear of spiritual attack was as real to him as the fear of Vikings. Chapter 8. The Sound of the Night. As Godric sat awake, recovering from his terror, a sound drifted through the stone walls. It was faint, carried on the cold wind from the valley below. Clang. Clang, clang. The church bell. It was 2 a.m., the start of the watch. This bell connected the entire medieval world. It woke Ealdred in his hut, signaling him to check the fire. It woke Godric in his castle, signaling that the demons of the night were retreating. But for the third group of people, the monks in the abbey, it was not a signal to roll over. It was a signal to work. While the world slept, or tried to, thousands of men and women across England were waking up to sing. They believed that if they stopped praying in the middle of the night, the world would literally end. They were the spiritual engine room of the kingdom. Godric listened to the bell. It was a comfort. It meant the monks were awake, fighting the devil so he didn't have to. He looked at his wife, sleeping soundly beside him, enclosed by the heavy velvet curtains of the four-poster bed. These curtains created a room within a room, trapping their body heat and keeping out the drafts. "The sun will rise," Godric whispered to himself. But outside the castle walls, in the deep woods of the Weald, something else was waking up. Not a demon, and not a monk. Torches were flickering in the distance, the sound of muffled hooves on the frozen mud. The night in 1025 was never truly safe.
Chapter 9. The Holy Insomnia. While Lord Godric battled his nightmares and Aldred slept in his huddle, a third group was intentionally breaking the laws of nature. 2 miles from the village stood the stone abbey of St. Jude. While the rest of the world craved sleep, the monks declared war on it. At 2 a.m., the bell that Godric heard signaled matins. Brother Thomas, a young novice of barely 16, dragged himself from his pallet. The dormitory, Dorter, was a long, freezing hall where 50 monks slept in rows. There was no privacy and absolutely no heat. The rule was strict. A monk must sleep in his habit, or robe, ready to meet God at a moment's notice. Thomas's feet hit the stone floor, so cold it felt like burning. He stumbled into the dark corridor, guided only by the faint light of a single tallow candle held by the abbot. Historical reality. Medieval monks practiced polyphasic sleep in the extreme. They went to bed at 7 p.m., woke up at 2 a.m. for 2 hours of singing and prayer, went back to sleep at 4 a.m. and woke up again at 6 a.m. for lauds. They were perpetually tired. This chronic sleep deprivation was considered a spiritual discipline, to weaken the body so the spirit could rise. As Thomas chanted in the shadowy chapel, his breath visible in the air, he pinched his own arm to stay awake. Falling asleep during matins was a sin punishable by fasting. Here, in the flickering candlelight, sleep was not a comfort, it was a temptation from the devil. Chapter 10. The Wolf at the Door. Back in the village, the silence of the watch was shattered. The torches seen from Godric's castle were not friendly travelers. In 1025 A.D., the woods were not governed by police. They belonged to outlaws. Aldred was in the middle of his second sleep when the sound tore through his dreams. A scream. Not a human scream, but the high-pitched, terrifying shriek of a horse in pain. Then came the shout, "Fire!" In the modern world, a fire is a tragedy. In a medieval village of timber and thatch, it was an apocalypse. Aldred rolled off the straw pallet, adrenaline instantly clearing the fog of sleep. "Ilara, get the children!" he roared. There was no time to find shoes. He grabbed the iron billhook, a farming tool used for cutting branches. This was the reality of the 11th century. Every farmer was a soldier in his own home. He kicked the door open. The night, usually pitch black, was now bathed in a terrifying orange glow. The neighbor's barn was ablaze. Shadows, men with torches and axes were moving through the smoke. Bandits. Chapter 11. Fighting in the Blind. Combat in the movies is well lit. Combat in 1025 A.D. at night was a chaotic nightmare of shadows. Aldred stepped out into the mud. The smoke stung his eyes. He couldn't distinguish friend from foe. He saw a figure running toward his hut. Was it a neighbor fleeing or a bandit attacking? "Stay back!" Aldred swung his billhook blindly. The figure halted. It was Miller, the village baker. "They're after the grain store," Miller choked out, his face black with soot. The women and children didn't run into the woods. The wolves were there. Instead, Ilara gathered her children and the goat behind the hut, covering them with the wet cowhides to protect them from falling sparks. This chapter reveals a harsh truth. The night was a weapon. The bandits used the darkness to terrify. They didn't need to kill everyone. They just needed to create enough chaos to steal the winter food stocks. For Aldred, the darkness he usually found comforting for sleep had turned into a shroud of death. Chapter 12. The Lord Awakes. Up in the manor, Lord Godric was no longer paralyzed by the mare. He was now the protector of the realm. Wolf, the servant, was buckling armor onto Godric's chest over his nightshirt. There was no time for full chainmail. Godric grabbed his sword. "Light the beacon," Godric commanded. On the roof of the keep, a guard lit a basket of tar. This was the medieval 911 call. It signaled to the surrounding farms that the Lord was awake and coming. Godric rode out of the castle gates with 5 armed men. They didn't have flashlights. They rode by the light of the moon and the burning barn below. The sound of galloping hooves thundered down the valley. To the bandits, this sound was the end of the raid. To Aldred and Ilara, huddled in the smoke, it was the sound of salvation. Chapter 13. The Aftermath of Adrenaline. The bandits fled before Godric arrived, taking 3 sacks of grain and a pig. The fire was beaten out with wet blankets and buckets of ditch water. Now came the hardest part of the night. It was 4 a.m. The adrenaline was fading, leaving them shaking with cold and shock. Aldred sat on a scorched log outside his hut. His hands were trembling. Ilara came to him, checking his body for wounds. He was unharmed, but their sense of safety was shattered. "We cannot sleep," Ilara whispered. But biology demanded it. This is where the second sleep took a dark turn. Tonight, it was the sleep of exhaustion. They went back inside the hut. The smell of smoke was overpowering. The children cried themselves to sleep. Aldred lay down, eyes wide open, staring at the dark thatch roof, gripping his billhook. The peace of the night was a lie. He would doze fitfully, waking at every snap of a twig.
Chapter 14. The Healer's Midnight. Not everyone went back to sleep. Miller, the baker, had been burned on his arm trying to save his flour. He sat in the hut of old Maud, the village cunning woman, healer. There were no hospitals, no 24-hour pharmacies. Maud worked by the light of a single tallow candle. She didn't have sterile gauze. She had spider webs, used to stop bleeding, and a poultice made of crushed garlic and honey. "Hold still," she croaked. She applied the mixture to the burn. The pain was excruciating. Miller bit down on a piece of leather belt to stop from screaming. In 1025, pain management was non-existent. You simply endured. Maud chanted a soft rhyme, part prayer, part pagan spell, to soothe him. "Bone to bone, blood to blood, heal in the name of the Holy Rood." For the sick and the injured, the night was endless. There were no painkillers to knock you out. You counted the minutes until dawn, because the darkness amplified every throb of pain. Chapter 15. The Stranger on the Road. While the village licked its wounds, a solitary traveler was miles away on the old Roman road. His name was Cedric, a messenger from London. He had missed the safety of the town before sunset. Now he was in the outer dark. Traveling at night was considered insanity. The road was full of potholes that could break a horse's leg. Cedric led his horse by foot, feeling the ground in front of him. He saw a light in the distance, a roadside inn. But don't imagine a Holiday Inn. A medieval roadside inn was often just a barn with a fireplace. Cedric paid a penny to enter. Inside, 20 strangers lay on the floor, wrapped in their cloaks, sleeping shoulder to shoulder. The air smelled of stale ale and unwashed bodies. The rule of the road, you slept with your money pouch inside your underpants and your dagger in your hand. You trusted no one. Cedric found a spot between a snoring merchant and a pile of hay, pulled his cloak tight, and closed his eyes. This was the sleep of the wary. Chapter 16. The Drunkard's Peace. Inside that same inn, several men were unconscious, not from fatigue, but from ale. In 1025 AD, water was often contaminated. People drank weak ale, small beer, from morning until night. It was a source of calories and hydration. But at night, the stronger ale came out. For the poor, alcohol was the only escape from the harshness of life. It was their heater, their painkiller, and their sleeping pill. One man, a tinker, snored loudly in the corner. He had passed out sitting up. His sleep was dreamless and heavy. He wouldn't wake up for the watch. He wouldn't wake up for wolves. He would wake up with a pounding headache when the rooster crowed, ready to face another day of labor with a dry throat. Chapter 17. The Blindness of Age. Back in Eldred's village, inside the hut next to the burned barn, lay Eldred's grandmother, Edith. She was blind. Cataracts had taken her sight 5 years ago. For Edith, the death of the sun meant nothing. Her entire life was night. Yet her sleep was different. Without the cue of sunlight, her circadian rhythm was drifting. She was often awake when others slept, listening. She was the village's memory. While the family slept, she lay in the dark reciting the old stories to herself, keeping the history alive. Tonight, she smelled the smoke before anyone else. She heard the horses first. Now, as the family slept their exhausted second sleep, Edith sat up. She reached out and touched the face of her great-grandson. She was the guardian of the night. In a world without books, the elderly were the libraries, and the night was their reading time.
Chapter 18. The Return of the Sun. The ordeal of the night began to fade. Slowly, imperceptibly, the sky to the east turned from black to a bruised purple, then to a cold steel gray. The rooster in Eldred's coop fluttered its wings and let out a crow. It was ragged, but loud. This was the universal alarm clock. Eldred opened his eyes. They felt like they were filled with sand. His body ached from the fight in the cold floor, but he was alive. He looked at Alara. She was already stirring, reaching for the flint to restart the fire. The baby was crying for milk. The second sleep was over. The magical, terrifying, intimate world of the night evaporated. The shutters were thrown open. The sun, weak and watery, broke over the horizon. The terror of the bandits, the prayers of the monks, the pain of the burn, and the dreams of the Lord, all were pushed aside. There was wood to chop. There were cows to milk. There was a roof to repair. Eldred stepped out into the morning mist. He looked at the charred remains of the neighbor's barn, then up at the rising sun. He took a deep breath of the icy air.
Chapter 19. The Midday Demon, the Siesta. Location: the fields of Wessex. The sun is at its peak. It is noon. In modern America, this is the lunch hour, a quick sandwich at a desk. But in 1025 AD, the rhythm of life obeyed the sun, not the corporation. Eldred and his fellow peasants stopped their work. The winter sun was weak, but the labor was heavy. They did not have coffee to power through the afternoon slump. They had something else. They collapsed right there in the field, or under the shelter of a hedgerow. This was the midday nap. To the monks in the nearby abbey, this urge to sleep at noon was spiritual warfare. They called it acedia, or the noonday demon. a spirit of lethargy that tempted men to be lazy. But for Eldred, it was biological necessity. He leaned against a gnarled oak tree, wrapped in his cloak. He closed his eyes for 20 minutes. This wasn't laziness, it was fuel. In a world without artificial energy drinks, this short burst of sleep allowed them to work until the sun went down. For a modern reader who feels guilty for napping, this is a look back at a time when resting was as natural as breathing. The field was silent, save for the heavy breathing of tired men. They slept together, ate together, and worked together. The concept of personal space was centuries away. Chapter 20. The Unspoken Call, Nature's Challenge. Location: Lord Godric's Manor, deep night. Let's talk about something history books often skip, but which every human wonders about. The toilet. It is 2 a.m. again. Winter. The temperature inside the stone castle is near freezing. Lord Godric wakes up with a full bladder. Today, we walk to a heated bathroom with flushing water. In 1025 AD, leaving the bed was a tactical error. To step out of the warm furs was to freeze, and the latrine, garderobe, was a hole in the stone floor built into a drafty alcove over the moat. Using it in winter caused frostbite on one's backside. So, they didn't leave the bed. Godric reached under the bed for the chamber pot. It was a ceramic bowl. He used it right there inside the heavy velvet curtains of the bed, while his wife lay sleeping inches away. This level of intimacy shocks the modern American mind. We view bathroom habits as the ultimate private act. But 1,000 years ago, shame was different. The sound of urinating into a pot was a common nighttime soundtrack. The worst part? The pot stayed there until morning. The smell of ammonia would slowly mix with the smell of wood smoke and lavender. This was the scent of a medieval night. Wolf, the servant, would have the unenviable job of emptying it into the moat at dawn. Chapter 21. The Courtship of the Board. Bundling location. A prosperous farmhouse 10 miles away. How did teenagers date in a world without cars, movie theaters, or privacy? How did they fall in love when parents slept in the same room? Enter the custom of bundling. Young Osbert, 18, wanted to court the miller's daughter, Alice, 17. He couldn't take her out to dinner. It was dark and dangerous outside. So, the courtship happened in bed. Alice's father allowed Osbert to stay the night. But there were rules. Osbert and Alice lay in the same bed, fully clothed in their thick woolens. Sometimes, a heavy wooden board was placed between them to prevent immoral contact. Or Alice might be sewn into a sack up to her waist. They lay there in the dark, whispering for hours. The sexual tension was palpable, electric. They could feel the warmth of each other's bodies, hear each other's breathing, but could not touch. This enforced restraint made the emotions more intense. In the pitch black, stripped of visual distractions, they fell in love through words and whispers. It was a torture and a delight. This was medieval dating, high stakes, high intimacy, and the watchful ear of the father sleeping just across the room. Chapter 22. The Vigil of the Dead Location. Ealdred's Village. Not every night was for sleep. Some nights were for the soul. Old Weaver, a village elder, had died just after sunset. In the modern world, a body is whisked away to a funeral home. In 1025, the body stayed in the house. Tonight, no one in Weaver's hut would sleep. This was the wake. They placed candles around the body to keep the demons away. The family sat around the corpse, drinking ale and telling stories of his life. Why stay awake? Because of a deep, primal fear. The soul was vulnerable. They believed that before the soul left the body completely, evil spirits might try to snatch it. The living had to watch the dead to ensure safe passage. The atmosphere was heavy, spooky, yet oddly celebratory. Shadows flickered on the dead man's face, making him look like he was moving. Every creak of the timber house made them jump. They fought their own exhaustion with fear and duty. In 1025, death was not hidden. It was a guest in the living room. Chapter 23, The Science of Sleep, Herbal Magic. Location, the monastery infirmary. What if you couldn't sleep? Insomnia is not a modern invention. Brother Thomas, the young monk, was suffering. His mind raced with doubts about God. He tossed and turned on his straw mat. He went to the infirmarian, the monk in charge of medicine. There were no sleeping pills, no melatonin gummies. The infirmarian gave him a cup of dwale. Dwale was a medieval anesthetic and sleep aid. It was a potent, dangerous cocktail. Bile of a boar, lettuce. Wild lettuce has mild sedative properties, vinegar, hemlock, and opium poppy. Drink, the infirmarian whispered. Thomas drank the bitter, thick liquid. Within minutes, the world dissolved. This wasn't natural sleep. It was a chemical coma. The line between medicine and poison was very thin in 1025. If the mixture was too strong, Thomas wouldn't wake up for matins. He wouldn't wake up at all. He drifted into a dark, heavy void, escaping the cold and his own thoughts. Chapter 24. The Fear of the Moon Location, the Forest Edge. The moon is beautiful to us. To Ealdred, the full moon was a spotlight for danger. Tonight, the moon was full. Ealdred barred the door with extra force. "The lunatics will be out," he muttered. The word lunatic comes from luna, moon. They believed the light of the full moon could literally drive a person mad if it touched their sleeping face. If a beam of moonlight came through a crack in the shutters and hit a sleeping child, Alara would rush to cover them. They believed the moon drew moisture from the brain, causing seizures or madness. So, on bright nights, they hid in absolute darkness. While we open our curtains to see the view, they sealed themselves in coffins of wood to protect their sanity. Chapter 25. The King's Burden. Location, the Royal Palace, Winchester. Let us zoom out to the most powerful man in the land, King Nut, Canute. He slept on a bed of silk and imported cotton, surrounded by guards. Yet, he slept less than the peasant Eldred. The king suffered from the curse of kings. His bedroom was a public office. Even at night, advisors would whisper through the curtains. Couriers arrived at 3 a.m. with news of Viking fleets or rebellious earls. Knut lay awake, staring at the embroidered canopy. He envied the peasant. The peasant worried about one cow. The king worried about a nation. To help him sleep, he employed a harper. A musician sat in the corner of the royal bedchamber, playing a soft, repetitive melody on a lyre for hours. This was the medieval white noise machine. The music drifted through the cold stone room, a desperate attempt to drown out the noise of politics so the king could close his eyes. Chapter 26. The Architecture of Dreams. What did they dream about? Neuroscience tells us dreams process our day. Ealdred dreamt of grain, of wolves, of warmth. Godric dreamt of battles and status. But they interpreted dreams differently. To a modern American, a dream is subconscious nonsense. To them, dreams were messages. If Ealdred dreamt of a dead relative, it wasn't a memory, it was a visitation. The dead were actually there. If he dreamt of a snake, it was a warning from God. This changed how they woke up. They didn't just brush off a nightmare. They analyzed it. They prayed about it. A bad dream could change their decisions for the day. "I cannot plough the south field today," Ealdred might say. "I saw a crow in my sleep." Sleep was not just rest, it was a spiritual internet connection.
Chapter 27. The Longest Night. Winter Solstice. Location: all of England. It is late December. The sun rises at 8:30 a.m. and sets at 3:30 p.m. This means 17 hours of darkness. How do you sleep for 17 hours? You don't. This long darkness was a test of psychological endurance. People spent hours awake in the dark, telling stories. This is where folklore was born.
Beowulf, King Arthur, stories of dragons and giants. These were not written in books. They were forged in the long, boring, terrifying darkness of the winter solstice to keep people sane. The bed became a stage. Aldred told stories to his children, not just to entertain, but to stop them from being afraid of the sounds outside. The oral tradition of humanity is a direct result of the long, pre-electric night. Chapter 28. The Eternal Contrast. Conclusion of the narrative arc. Look back at Aldred in his hut and Godric in his castle. They are separated by wealth, by walls, and by status, but in the dark they are equal. When the candle burns out, the king and the peasant face the same absolute blackness. They both fear the mayor. They both seek warmth. They both listen for the church bell to tell them they are still alive. In the modern USA, we have conquered the night. We have banished the dark with LEDs. We have heated our homes to 72 degrees, and we have drugs to force us to sleep. We have gained comfort, but we have lost the mystery. We have lost the second sleep, that magical hour of midnight creativity and intimacy. We have lost the communal warmth of sleeping in a pile of loved ones. We have lost the connection to the stars and the moon. As Aldred wakes up to another freezing morning, chipping the ice off his water bucket, he possesses a resilience we can only dream of. He has faced the dark, the wolves, and the cold, and he has won. Sleep, for them, was not a pause, it was a victory. The end.